Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are today. Today's webinar is going to focus on managing risk in the Agile Enterprise. This is part of the Deeper Dive into Agile series. My name is Dr. Sriram Rajagopalan. I have a doctoral degree in management and leadership, MBA in management, MS in computer engineering, and a bachelor in electronics and communication engineering. I started my career as a software engineer, progressed along as team leader, business analyst, project manager, scrum master, and agile coach. I have served in the capacities of director and vice president as well. I have a number of different certifications which include portfolio management, program management, project management, agile, risk management. I'm a scrum master, scrum product owner, agile certified coach. I have a Six Sigma black belt. I'm also an instructional designer, speaker, writer, and author. I have teaching and training experience in a number of colleges in the US, India, and in Vietnam. Today's webinar is part of the series on Deeper Dive into Agile. Each webinar is approximately 1 hour long. We will reserve time at the end for questions. Unlike the previous webinars, each webinar is a standalone webinar. The webinars may demonstrate the concept using a tool. There is no expectation on your part to set up access with Spira team. The completion certificate is based on specific requirements. To earn this completion certificate, you register for the webinar and attend it. If you are unable to attend, view the archive when it becomes available. Once you have met all the requirements, you will be eligible to receive the certificate. Again, just as a reminder, there is no dependency on any previous webinars, and there is also no quiz on these webinars. The Deeper Dive into Agile had 3 webinars. We have already delivered 2 webinars, one on preparing for career roles in the Agile arena and estimating user stories in the Agile space. Now we will focus on managing risk in the Agile Enterprise. Frequently, people come and ask me one important question. That is all about, should risks be managed in the Agile Enterprise? Isn't that supposed to be associated with traditional linear sequential project management processes? That's not the case. Risk is frequently associated with a bad connotation. If you look at basics of the SWOT analysis, which is further augmented by project, program, portfolio, product, and process management literature, risk is associated with both opportunities and threat. As a result, trying to associate risk only with managing threats and eliminating that aspect of risk management in agile approaches is inappropriate. So risk is not a bad word. Let's define risk. Risk is defined as any uncertain event that has a potential to impact positively or negatively the project objectives. It could influence or arise from any of the 10 knowledge areas that is defined in Project Management Book of Knowledge. Among the many ways of looking at risks, there are new terms and terminologies that emerge. Project Management Book of Knowledge comes to the help in defining some of these terms and technologies. Risk, by definition, is associated with the probability of occurrence. It's associated with an uncertainty, therefore. Anybody that walks on a wet floor can potentially fall. That does not mean that everybody who walks on the wet floor is going to fall. So risk is associated with probability of occurrence. On the other hand, issue means the event has occurred. The person now stuck on the elevator shows that a stuck elevator is a reality. So probability of occurrence is 100%. Another way of looking at risk is by known and unknown risk categories. So by definition, it is associated with an uncertainty, and so you are able to predict what can potentially happen with some of the project objectives. Every flight has to compete against the gravitational force where the wings have to generate the appropriate amount of lift. So it is potentially possible that you are able to predict certain events that can go wrong, and you are able to put response plan in action. On the other hand, weather patterns can create different types of risks that you may not necessarily know. For example, a microburst. which could actually cause a heavy downpour of rainfall on the wings, causing a nosedive of the aircraft. Alternate ways of looking at risks are by looking at primary and secondary risks. Primary risk is the risk associated with anything that can go wrong as part of your natural course of action in the project schedule. Secondary risk, on the other hand, is going to be associated with any potential risk that can happen when you invoke a risk response plan. Another way of looking at risk is by pure and residual types of risks. Pure risk is the risk that is associated with huge impact and could be coming from natural calamities. Residual risk is associated with the risks that is going to leave a residue even after the risk has been properly addressed. Example is a surgery. Even after the surgery is over, you still have the mark of the surgery imprinted. Another way to look at risk is also by variability and ambiguity. Variability risk is the amount of tolerance you have available in certain types of risks that you are able to work with. On the other hand, ambiguity is the risk associated inherently in the assumptions that you are making or in the constraints that you are working with. Emergent risks are the unknowable unknowns, where you are basically looking at external events as well as some internal events that could emerge due to laws and regulations. Project Management Book of Knowledge introduces 10 different knowledge areas, and these are listed over here. As you can see, risk management itself is one of the 10 knowledge areas. Contrary to how many people think, as though the project management knowledge areas are linear and sequential, risk management can interact with any one of these knowledge areas, not necessarily in a linear or sequential way. For instance, in using the time boxing principle, you could put together a 2-week iteration for some user stories that have been committed by the team. But as the team encounters challenges to completing one or more user stories, the actual velocity committed for that particular sprint can come down. So risk can potentially impact committed user stories within the time schedule. So this kind of challenge exists in each and every one of those knowledge areas that are presented over here. So is risk relevant in Agile? Let's elaborate a little bit more further. So one of the examples that I'm showing over here is a simple ECG waveform. You have a P, Q, R, S, T components that are associated in an ECG waveform. And this really struck a chord in me because it introduces some of the 5 different knowledge areas as how they are relevant in Agile for me. The P in this example, I'm using it to demonstrate as procurement. Every time you have procurement, it is associated with risk. So the contractors or the consultants that you are working with could actually not necessarily deliver according to the contract, which means contract administration has to be in place, and that reduces the risk that is associated with the contractor's ability to deliver. Similarly, the non-performance of the contractors could add additional work to the existing team members, introducing resource overloading. Quality is another component. So the lack of attention to detail or lack of technical excellence may compromise the design. As a result of that compromise in design, you will see escaped defects. Lack of working software therefore challenges the delivery of ongoing value to the customer and to the business. These things will result in escaped defects, which would be also reflected in the voice of the customer feedback and the voice of business feedbacks. The next one is going to be resources. The resistance of the team to Agile practices leads to several failure patterns of Agile. Similarly, the lack of self-organization impacts the ability of the team to progress. So both from a management team culture perspective, the resources ability to embrace Agile practices and be self-organized is critical. The next one is going to be scope. Although we are already having fixed scope to work with because of the time boxing principles, velocity compromises can actually impact the cycle time of how long it takes for an idea from its beginning till completion. So constant changes to the scope as you are working through releases, not iterations, demotivates the team's focus on the product's vision. Then the schedule, which is reflected in that way of time boxing. Unpredictable duration and cost can actually lead to stakeholder dilemma on whether or not agile practices are appropriate for this particular initiative. Customer dissatisfaction fatigue due to the constant delay in value delivery as well as this quality slips can lead to customer satisfaction. So the PQRST is a very good simple example to show risk is prevalent regardless of the method of choice used for software delivery. So why is risk management pivotal? When you look at risk, it is primarily evaluating the risks associated with the delivery and the benefits that you are going to get as a result of what you are trying to do to mitigate or address the risks. So effective risk management is pivotal to not only Agile, but also any type of project management framework. This could avoid cost overrun, schedule delay, quality pitfalls, challenges associated with the resources, conflicts from the stakeholders, issues impeding communication, impact to the scope, as well as confusions in the contracting processes. So, how do you manage risk effectively? In order for you to manage risk, you need to understand the risk exposure. In order to truly understand the risk exposure, there are three elements that you have to truly understand. Those are the risk threshold, risk appetite, and risk trigger. Risk threshold is associated with the degree of acceptable variations from project objectives. So it changes from one stakeholder to another stakeholder. A quality test manager may not necessarily like the fact that you have a couple of defects, and the quality manager may require that these defects are fixed. On the other hand, the product owner may be able to live with those two minor defects and be able to move forward with the release or the iteration. The stakeholders' degree of acceptable variations from the project objectives can actually have slight variations. Risk appetite, on the other hand, is the acceptable amount of overall risk threshold for the project for all the stakeholders and the entire organization. Risk trigger is a specific warning or a symptom that is indicating a risk is about to occur or has already occurred. So the stages of risk management. According to the Project Management Book of Knowledge, you have several stages, and these are the plan risk management, identify risks, qualitative and quantitative analysis of the risk, planning for risk responses, implementing the risk responses, and monitoring the risks. There are several artifacts that come out of these particular stages. And these are, from the plan risk management, you get the risk management plan that articulates how you are going to manage risk in your project. Identification of the risk leads to the risk register where you document a number of different risks. Qualitative and quantitative analysis actually come down with the contingency reserve that you need to have to address the project, as well as the urgent and watch list. What needs to be immediately addressed and what needs to be monitored so that you can address them when it becomes a reality. As a result, you update the risk register consistently and continuously. The planned risk response comes with a risk response plan for the entire project. Similarly, you can do the same thing in Agile too. Implement risk responses leads to the change request that evolves from implementation of the risk responses, and then you consistently monitor these things. And again, if you look at these stages, it may look as though they are applicable only in big upfront planning, but that's not necessarily true. So let's take a look at how it applies in Agile ceremonies. So as you are doing the product backlog, grooming the product backlog and putting together the vision and mapping all the different functionalities and the features and the themes, you can come up with a risk-adjusted product backlog. So for every one of those themes or every one of those features and precise, you can also go down to another level of the actual user stories. You can start documenting a few risks that can impede delivery. In other words, what are some of the risks that needs to be properly addressed so that it is ready for release as well as iteration planning. In the qualitative and quantitative analysis, the team can actually look at the previous risks as well as the documented risk for the user stories and can review what information they need to know much in advance before they commit to those user stories in an iteration. As a result, these things can be risk accommodated and then moved forward into the iteration backlog. This can help the team to actually provide a better pointing or better estimate of the story point value associated with the user stories and then commit them for the iteration. As the actual iteration is moving forward, you are able to review the risks and then commit as to how you can move forward within the iteration. And as the iteration continues into the daily sprint, as you know, once it's committed and you are actually moving forward with the daily stand-up, you can monitor the risk throughout the iteration as well as during the review and retrospective exercises to see how you can address those risks within the sprint or provide documentation as to how subsequent iterations have to be updated to reflect on how these risks can be mitigated. Recall, one of the important questions in the daily stand-up is what is impeding the team's ability to deliver. So, the stages of risk management very nicely associates themselves with actual way you conduct agile ceremonies as well. So, let's clarify risk one more time. There are different types of looking at risks, and we had talked about known and unknown risks, and these things could be information that you are able to predict much in advance or things that you are not able to predict at all. The threats and opportunities, risks can be a positive or a negative event. If it is a negative event, it is threat. If it is a positive event, it is opportunity. It could be associated as a primary or secondary risk. Primary risks are the risks that are associated with how you conduct the natural course of activities and risks associated with those events. Secondary risks are associated with events that could potentially go wrong because you are invoking the risk response plan as a result of an issue happening. We talked about risks and issues based upon the probability of occurrence. Risk has a probability of occurrence, issues do not. Issues means it has occurred. Pure and residual risks are another way of looking at the risks. The impact of the risk is going to be huge in a pure risk, and the residual risk is going to help you understand what risks have already materialized and what the impact could be, and the residue that the risk has left with the project. So how do you go about identifying risks? There are a number of ways of identification of the risks. Documentation reviews is one of the best examples that you can do. So you can either review the business requirements document or the functional specification documents. In the case of Agile, you can look at the actual themes, the product roadmap, the product vision, the product charter, as well as move forward with the wireframes and a number of different project artifacts that you create as a part of Agile ceremonies. And then you can do the checklist analysis. You can provide a documented checklist as to how information moves from one team to another or what information is supposed to be looked at. Checklist analysis is another tool where you can review the list of things that have been done as a consistent way of doing things and evaluate whether there is any opportunity for improvement. Assumptions analysis is never taking any assumptions for granted and making sure that for every assumptions there could potentially be a risk associated. You can also use diagramming techniques often available in the sequence diagram, flow charting, and all those techniques to evaluate what can potentially go wrong as part of a process or data analysis. And then you can also do some information gathering exercises through interviewing, surveys, observations, focus groups, and all those things to gather more information about how certain risks that are not necessarily set can be elevated and understood so that you are able to put together proper response for those kind of risks. So risk analysis is all about predetermined list, coming down with a predetermined list of categories for assessing individual project and sources of overall project risks. And there is a very well-known framework that is called PESTLE, P-E-S-T-L-E. It's often called the political, environmental, societal, technical, legal, and economical impact. I have added the ethical and demographic dimensions to it, and I call it PES lead. So that's a framework that you can take a look at and see, how you can come down with predefined risk categories and understand those risks associated within your project context. Alternatively, not all these terms may necessarily be impactful to your project, and so you can start looking at TCOP. TCOP is another framework. If PESLI does not necessarily completely apply, you can look at TCOP. TCOP stands for technical, environmental, commercial, operational, and political elements. And then VUCA. VUCA stands for the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguity present in your project. Alternatively, one way I have come down with is my own principle called TOE principle. It stands for the technical feasibility, which focuses on can we do it, and then the operational feasibility about can we sustain it, and the environmental feasibility focusing on can we afford it. So those are the principles or frameworks that you can use based upon the complexity of your particular project. So qualitative evaluation leads up to a lookup table that has the probability of impact. You can basically come down with what is considered as a high risk and a low risk, or probabilities associated with these high risk as well as the impacts associated with the high, low, medium quality of risks. As a result, you can categorize risk using the TCOP or PES lead principles that impacts to your particular project. And you can come down with a watch list as to what are some of the things that you don't need to necessarily immediately address by putting exhaustive risk response plans. So I always call them don't major in the minor. And then the pure list, things that could have huge impact on your particular project and what you have to do at this point to address those things if they ever materializes. One example of how you categorize risks is the risk breakdown structure for your particular project. So in this example, I have associated different factors like the time, cost, scope, quality, stakeholder, and controls that needs to be in place, and come down with low, medium, high level things that can potentially go wrong. So for instance, on a cost, I'm working with a contracting or a consulting relationship, which means there is a potential possibility of high risk associated from a cost perspective. On the other hand, on the stakeholder side, I have limited and few stakeholders, which means the communication channels will be very limited. I would be able to get the support probably required, and so I am putting it as a low. But if there are multiple stakeholders or highly visible and new and changing project exists, then it's going to be high. So I'm basically coming down with a set of categories for what is going to constitute a low, medium, high project risks. The quantitative approaches can also benefit from PERT approaches, which is going to be the pessimistic, optimistic, and most likely approaches. It's also called triangulation. And you basically come down with contingency reserves for every risk response, and you incorporate that as part of your agile iteration planning. Reevaluate the risk when one issue materializes, because risks can have domino effect. They can be dependent upon each other. So if one risk materializes, the probability of another risk materializing is also definitely present. So establish that. And then you can also use risks as a potential way of control to evaluate how you put together a go or no-go decision for your iteration or release. And map acceptable quality control needs so that you are able to evaluate how you can continuously improve risk management processes, as well as how these risks can have an impact on your agile value delivery. The quantitative approach leads to generating the contingency reserve, which is also the expected monetary value. In this particular example, for one particular iteration, I have identified 4 types of risks, A, B, C, and D, and associated a probability of occurrence and a cost impact associated with that. The contingency need, often called so-called risk score, is the product of the probability and cost impact. So 30% of $40,000 is $12,000. That's how it is. We are arriving at the contingency need. And the total $68,000 represents the expected monetary value or the contingency reserve that you need to have in place should these things happen. Now, risk D, let's come up with some scenarios. So risk D has now occurred. How much is left in the contingency reserve? Oftentimes people look at the $15,000 listed under the contingency need for risk D and say, $68,000 minus $15,000, $53,000 is what is really left in the contingency reserve. But that's not true. When you say D has occurred means the probability is 100%. So you need 100% of $30,000, which is the cost impact. And so 68,000 minus $30,000, you are only left with $38,000. Now, because B is put in the negative terms for the cost impact, that's an opportunity. So you want to maximize the likelihood of that happening. And now let's take a look at risk B has occurred. Now, assuming risk D and risk B are happening mutually exclusively, they're not connected at all. Now, if you think like risk D has not occurred and now risk B has occurred, if that's the case, how much is left in the contingency reserve? Now, $68,000, the B has occurred, which means 100% of $10,000 is a cash inflow to the project, and so $10,000 gets added to the actual project initiative. So 68,000 plus $10,000 is going to be $78,000. So there are a lot of different scenarios depending upon whether B is happening before D or after D. All those kind of things you can evaluate, and so you can properly address the iteration planning as well as the daily stand-up accordingly. So it's a very good way of taking a look at how you come up with potential risk response plans and monitor them throughout the iterations. So comparison of the qualitative and quantitatives. The qualitative approach does not go into a lot of additional details, so it's very subjective and mandatory, and it's very fast. It addresses the individual risks without seeing the big picture. Oftentimes we come down with a probability scale, not necessarily continuous probability, and we focus on what risks has to be prioritized, and so you are able to move forward. Quantitative approach is objective and optional. That is what Project Management Book of Knowledge also recommends. So we don't need to necessarily go to the level of quantitative risk analysis, even in agile approaches, because of the time boxing and the fast approaches to iterative and incremental delivery. Qualitative is still best. It takes into account the time and expertise that is really required, and that level of thinking need not necessarily be applicable, but that kind of subjective thought process can still be helpful in your qualitative risk analysis. It predicts the outcomes looking at the whole picture. So you can do these kind of risk analysis at a very high level for release level plannings, not necessarily at the iteration level planning. And you do use the continuous probability and come down with how you make decisions accordingly. It identifies the risks with the greatest impact so that you are able to focus on those particular risks and have a proper risk response plan to address those things. The risk response plan, we had talked earlier about sense and opportunity. So there are two different types of risk response plans. So the negative risks, you first want to avoid them, as much as possible. If you cannot avoid them, you want to mitigate the likelihood of them happening or reduce the probability of their occurrence. And if you can neither avoid it nor mitigate it, you want to transfer it to some external person who has the subject matter expertise to actually deal with that. And that's the best way to actually do this. And if none of those things can work because of the nature of your project or the complexity of your project nature, then you accept it. But acceptance should not necessarily be completely passive. It has to be thought through these stages before you come into the acceptance approach. When you do accept it, you are not putting together any risk response plan at all. The opposite side of the equation applies when you are looking at a positive risk or an opportunity. So whenever you try to avoid it, you want to exploit it over here. And if you want to mitigate it by reducing the probability of occurrence, you want to enhance it by actually increasing the probability of occurrence. If you want to transfer it to somebody else, you want to actually share the knowledge and the win-win here. So you want to share it. So the positive risk response focuses on exploiting, enhancing, and sharing, whereas the negative risk response focuses on avoiding, mitigating, and transferring. Both of them accept it as is. And if the boundary of control is not within the product owner's scope or the project manager's scope, if it's agile project management, then you move forward with the escalation. Escalation is all about escalating to the senior management so that they are able to use the management reserve and address these risks appropriately. One simple chart that many agile project managers as well as scrum masters and product owners use is a risk burndown chart. So across the releases, not iterations, across the release releases, if you are able to identify a number of different risks and document them in the risk register, then you will be able to monitor these risks and what plans you have in place to continuously address these risks, so that as the risks are getting addressed, retired, or eliminated, you are able to measure the risk burn down throughout the releases. This increases the level of confidence and comfort that people will have in ensuring that you are able to materialize the actual product vision. So it eliminates monitoring risk exposure across the iterations in a release. And things to observe are how much is the risk exposure of the backlog increasing or decreasing. So if there is a positive slope, things have increased, and so you want to put together proper plans in place. So in this particular case, iteration 3 to iteration 4, there was a spike, and similarly iteration 6 to iteration 7, there was an additional spike. So something else happened during those 2 iterations. And you should also constantly monitor what are some of the new emergent and secondary risks that are identified. Maybe these upward slopes are a result of those things. And the basics are, you want to evaluate the total risk exposure throughout the iteration. So you don't want to necessarily focus on one iteration and do this, but you want to measure this across the iterations. Monitor this every iteration and release, and discuss the health of the backlog and burn rate at governance meetings. So this is one example of how you can use risk in agile projects, the risk burn down report. Now in Spira Plan 6.0, we introduce a new risk module that's completely brand new, and it is a separate artifact rather than a custom property as we have done before. It helps you go through all the stages that we talked about, understand, assess, and track risks to the product's delivery, and it helps set up mitigations for each risk. So for a quick review, let's go to Spira demo. Let's demonstrate how Spira Plan accommodates risk and tracking risk across the entire risk lifecycle of your product within iterations or across the iterations. So currently, I'm in my Spira Plan instance, and when you look into the product information, there are a number of widgets available. One of the widgets that I have brought over here is the risk summary. This risk summary builds the probability impact grid based upon the number of risks that you are categorizing in your particular project. You will be able to automatically build this risk summary very quickly. And it shows the most important things that you have to focus on based upon the probability impact analysis. So let's take a look at how we can get to these elements over here. Now, when you go into the artifact section, you can see that there is a risk component. Unlike previous versions where we were able to have risk as a custom property, Spira Plan 6.0 is actually introducing risk as a separate artifact all by itself. So when you go into the risk element over here, you are going to see the actual risk register. So there is a new risk that I have actually documented, which is the use of methods that can be deprecated in the open source software currently being used. That's a business level risk. So you can document additional risks over here. And as you are documenting more risks, you are building the risk register right over here. So I'm going to introduce a new risk at this point. So clicking on the new risk brings a dialog box where you can add a lot of risks. So I'm going to add this risk over here. And so there is by default, we have these business, financial, other schedule, and technical risks captured. And this is again customizable because you would be able to add different types of risks that pertains to your product. So if you recall the pest lead, the TCOP, all those analysis, then you will be able to build the types of risks that you want to monitor for your particular product. And now I'm going to add a new risk. And in this new risk, I'm going to give a name. So let's talk about, licensing considerations of existing open source software. Okay, that's a new risk. And I'm going to call this as a financial risk. And then I'm associating this with one particular iterations. In this particular case, let's say I'm going to associate it with the highest level. So I have documented that. And this is going to be associated with any of the functional components that you have. So again, these could be related to the themes in the agile approaches. or the basic features that you have available. So let me put this under book management, and at this point the status looks it's identified. So I basically identified all this information, and I can add some additional data points here, which is like if the license structure changes, then we will have an issue. Okay, so we'll have an issue. So I have basically done this and I have saved this right now. So now once I hit the save button, it's going to keep the record as identified, and now it gives me an additional operation. And this operations is similar to the workflow that we currently have. So similar to how the requirements, the test case, and incident workflow, you can have a workflow for a risk as well. And we have basically built an immediate risk assessment lifecycle over here, basic one. And so the important goal of the risk analysis is to basically analyze the risk that is being identified. So as you analyze the risk, you want to associate the probability and impact, and you also want to associate a owner. And this owner is the risk owner who is having more knowledge about how to analyze this risk and quantify this. So let's assign some owner over here. So let's assign it to Fred, and let's come up with a probability. And this probability is the structure that you have already built according to the risk breakdown structure. So here there's going to be, this probability is possible if the license changes, and the impact is going to be critical. Okay, depending upon the actual type of change, it's going to be critical. So let's put this, and we can even put a review date as to when you want to go ahead and analyze this. But for now, these are identified as the immediate things that we have identified them, and we can come back and add some comments. Okay, so new risk to be analyzed for impact later. Okay, so we have done this, we have added the comment, and we come back and save it. Okay, so now this looks pretty decent, and if you want, you can add another one. And you can also associate tasks in Spiral Plan that is similar to the Spiral team. You can have task component to it where multiple people can be working on how it needs to be identified and things like that. But for now, I'm not going to focus on that particular aspect of it. So now the risk exposure is computed. The risk exposure is the product of the probability impact matrix. Now, if I go back to my actual library information system, my product page. So now there is an additional one that is captured over here. The possibility and the critical, there is one that is captured over here. So you can also directly click on this and go into the details of that particular risk again into much more analysis. So then you can also associate that with the property. So if I go over here, you can go and look at these things, risk impact, where is all this information coming from? So when I click on this impact, it's going to tell me, what are some of the things that I basically have captured as. This is again coming from how you want to capture your risk breakdown analysis. So I have captured all these things over here as to what catastrophic, critical, marginal, and impact going to be. Similarly, you can do this with probability analysis, the status, and all those things. And similarly, the workflow. So when you click on the workflow, it's going to give you the default workflow, but we can quickly analyze the default workflow as well. So when you are identifying something, the status looks as identified, and then you can analyze and reject the risk. These are the things that you saw as part of your operations. And then when you analyze the risk, it goes into an analysis stage where you will have evaluate and reject risk statuses. And when you evaluate it, you can add additional components like the risk response plans and things like that you can come down with. And then you can keep it open. If the risk becomes an issue, then you can keep it open, and then you can close it or reject it as appropriately. The risk is going to be closed only when it has been completely dealt with. In other words, it's either retired or the event that could cause that risk potentially has been completely addressed. So you are able to close the risk forever. So let's go back to the risk component one more time here. So you identified the risk at this point. So I'm going to pick up the same risk right now. So it's in analysis stage. Now you want to go ahead and evaluate the risk. So as part of your evaluation of the risk, you can come here and look at the mitigation steps. Although we are giving mitigation as the label here, mitigation could be any one of the risk response strategies that we talked about. So one of the risk response strategy would be to identify other alternatives for this open source software. Okay, so we can put a review date, 1 week from now, or the end of the iteration, or the end of 2 iterations, or things like that, and then you can save it. That could be one of the risk response plan. So, and all these things are associated to the risk response owner, Fred, and so you are able to put together now a new date as to when you want to actually review the risk and see whether this response plan that you had put in place is appropriate or needs to be reviewed, or additional risk response plans have to be identified. All those things can be done, and then you can hit the save button. That means you have dealt with the risk at this point. So this is a simple tool, and in the reporting section you have some risk specific reports also that have been built. So I'm going to basically go ahead and look at the risk response section here. So there are risk detailed and risk summary reports. So let's quickly look at the risk summary report. So let me make it a HTML report. For now I'm going to ignore all these things and create the report. So let's review this report. And so now it builds you an entire history of what the risk report looks like, what are the risks have been identified, how it can be dealt with, and all that information is pretty much available. This could help with the audit trail as well as with legal and compliance requirements as well. So that's pretty much what the risk aspect of that spiral plan provides. So let's go back to our presentation. So in summary, risk is all about the perception versus the reality. Risk has to be understood from a stakeholder's point of view, and not necessarily just from the project managers or the product owner's point of view alone. So understand the tolerance and threshold associated with the stakeholder as well as the organization as a whole. Capture the risk profile as we did right now in the communication plan as well. And the capturing of the risk in the risk register helps you how you are identifying the risk and what risks have been mitigated and all those things as part of your communication plan. Draft your own risk breakdown structure with the appropriate risk owners that are different from yourself. So I recommend that you start thinking in terms of the RACI and associate appropriate risk owners who will be able to understand the risk much better and deal with the risk when it happens through the appropriate risk response plan. Incorporate risk as part of your agile planning and monitoring cycle. Monitor and respond to the threats as well as with the opportunities, and always turn assumptions into risks to make sure that you are able to deliver the value. Questions? If there are any questions relating to the course administration, please reach out to Ms. Thea at marketing@inflectra.com. If there are any content related questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at Sriram at inflectra.com. So next steps, review previous webinars. If you have any thoughts on other webinars, please email us. Thanks for watching.